Hi, my name is Teresa, and today I want to talk about the history of censorship in comics. The history of censorship in comics really centers on the Comics Code Authority. And what the Comics Code Authority was a page taken from the Hays Code, which was the restrictions placed on movies between the 1930s and the 1960s. There were a bunch of rules listed that dictated what could and could not be shown on the movie screen. It's where we have gotten the rating systems for movies today that is a result of the Hays Code. Now, like the Hays Code, the Comics Code Authority was formed as a precaution against morally objectionable content in comics. Because we all know that morals are completely objective and not colored by a person's life experience, their religious beliefs, or their culture. That has nothing to do with a person's morals at all. And who cares about that? What they really wanted to do was protect the children, as if they didn't have parents whose job it was to protect them. And instead of going after systems that actually prevent parents from doing such things, they go after the content that these children may or may not even encounter ever. Anyways, back to the Comics Code Authority, or the CCA, or the Code, as I will be calling it throughout this video. The Code was technically a voluntary system that publishers did not have to adhere to, but the retailers that sold those books and the advertisers that helped produce those books looked to the code for reassurance. So if you didn't follow the code, it was likely that your comic book was not going to end up on the stands. And the big two publishers, Marvel and DC Comics, followed the code for quite a long time. The only two publishers that did not follow the code at all were Dell Comics, which is Disney's comics company. That was because they had their own internal review system that checked for what they deemed questionable material, and their comics were specifically tailored to children. So the likelihood that something would be morally questionable in there was not something that they really worried about. And yeah, it's just not something that they had to worry about at all. And then we also had Classics Illustrated, which, as the name suggests, was a company that produced classics in an illustrated form, and they didn't change the material there. You got what was already published, so they didn't follow the Comics Code Authority either. Now, let's move on to what the code restricted. And I want to do this before we go over the timeline of the code and how it affected comics, to really show the type of restrictions that these publishers had to work around. The first was crimes shall never be presented in such a way as to create sympathy for the criminal, to promote distrust of the forces of law and justice, or to inspire others with a desire to imitate criminals. Scenes of excessive violence shall be prohibited. Scenes of brutal torture, excessive and unnecessary knife and gunplay, physical agony, the gory and the gruesome crime shall be eliminated. Criminals shall not be presented so as to be rendered glamorous or to occupy a position which creates a desire for emulation. Policemen, judges, government officials, and respected institutions shall never be presented in such a way to create disrespect for established authority. All scenes of horror, excessive bloodshed, gory or gruesome crimes, depravity, lust, sadism, masochism shall not be permitted. No comic magazine shall use the words horror or terror in its title. All lurid, unsavory, gruesome illustrations shall be eliminated. Inclusions of stories dealing with evil shall be used or shall be published only where the intent is to illustrate a moral issue, and in no case shall evil be presented alluringly, nor so as to injure the sensibilities of the reader. In every instance, good shall triumph over evil, and the criminal punished for his misdeeds. If crime is depicted, it shall be as a sordid and unpleasant activity. Scenes dealing with or instruments associated with Walking Dead, torture, vampires, and vampirism, ghouls, cannibalism, and werewolfism are prohibited. Profanity, obscenity, smut, vulgarity, or words or symbols which have acquired undesirable meanings are forbidden. Females shall be drawn realistically without exaggeration of any physical qualities. Suggestive and salacious illustration or suggestive posture is unacceptable. Nudity with meretricious purpose and salacious posture shall not be permitted in the advertising of any product. Clothed figures shall never be presented in such a way as to be offensive or contrary to good taste or morals. Nudity in any form is prohibited, as is indecent or undue exposure. Illicit sex relations are neither to be hinted at nor portrayed. Rape scenes as well as sexual abnormalities are unacceptable. Sex perversion or any inference to same is strictly forbidden. Seduction and rape shall never be shown or suggested. That's a lot, but also a lot of it is very vague and subjective, and it really limited the stories that could be told. And in ways, it did make comic creators have to get even more creative to tell the stories that they wish they could. Here are some examples from the Comic Book League Defense Fund where they were intended to be one way, but had to be changed because of code, and how the meaning of those comic panels was lost because of the removal of such context. One of these changes actually led to a conversation about how women are portrayed in comics, and that is Green Lantern's infamous Women in Fridges panel. In fact, the phrase "fridging women" came from this particular comic issue. For those unfamiliar, in the comic, Kyle Renner's girlfriend was killed by someone from his rogues gallery and was left in the fridge for Kyle to find when he got home. This very likely would have sparked the conversation of how women are treated in the comic industry, either way, whether it was censored or not. But it is a moment that is actually pretty infamous, and the censorship of this panel, I believe, led to even worse imaginings for what happened to Kyle Rayner's girlfriend. And that is because in the original panel of this comic, it showed his girlfriend in the fridge with the door open, and she was fully in one piece. Her body was all together. There was no confusion about her being in the fridge in one piece. The edit that the CCA had them do was to show the panel but leave the fridge ajar so you could not see the body. And a common misconception that was bred from this edit was that not only was she killed and just put in the fridge, was that she was dismembered and her body parts were stuffed into the fridge. And that is much more gruesome. It just shows that censorship can muddle the story, even if it's just in a small way. And the story itself is flawed from the beginning. And Gail Simone went on to publish a blog about this particular issue and the creation of women characters in comic books, specifically for the intent to just further the man's story. And it was that blog post that brought this more into the comics culture awareness, and honestly just storytelling awareness in general. So love Gail Simone, love her for that. So the formation of the Comics Code Authority really started in 1954. It started with a man named Fredric Wertham and a book he wrote called The Seduction of the Innocent: The Influence of Comic Books on Today's Youth. Fredric Wertham was a psychiatrist and an author, and The Seduction of the Innocent was his most popular book. And in it, it argued that the depictions of violent sex, drug use, and other adult fare in crime comics led to kids becoming juvenile delinquents. In this book, he made claims that Batman and Robin were in a homosexual relationship, that depiction of violence in comics was evil to the eye, and that Wonder Woman was an S&M lesbian. And while the creator of Wonder Woman was into S&M, especially into BDSM, the bondage. I know that there's a movie about it. I know that that's like common knowledge, especially now. I do not know if it was common knowledge then. And also, if it was, just because the author was, and just because there may have been motifs in there that perhaps showed or hinted at that interest, it wasn't inherently meant to be that way. And also, that's not what those comics were about. It didn't show those things in those comics. And even if they did, doesn't matter. In April of that same year, of 1954, the U.S. Senate Subcommittee on Juvenile Delinquency had hearings on the comic book industry. Wertham was a witness in these hearings, and as a result of those hearings, the comic industry was afraid of government oversight, and it spurred them to make the Comics Magazine Association of America, the CMAA, and that was in September/October of that year. And that is who developed the Comics Code Authority based on successor organizations' codes, which was based on the Hays Code. The next notable thing that happened with the code was in 1956 when EC Comics reprinted a very popular comic that they had done called Judgment Day, and the code's issue with Judgment Day really called into question whether they were acting on the basis of racism in some cases, because Judgment Day was a story about a Black astronaut. The publisher was asked to remove the astronaut in the final panel of the story, and the story itself explored tensions between two different groups of differently colored robots, and it was clearly a critique of institutionalized racism in the United States. But the fact that the astronaut was Black was not the only one of the code's concerns. While William Gaines, who was the publisher for EC Comics, had little doubt, and a lot of people had little doubt that racism played a part in this, there were probable other causes that the CCA, and in particular the director, Charles Murphy, could claim as to why they had objections to the story. And this was a back and forth that EC Comics and the CCA had. Ultimately, it came to the verdict that the story could run if the artist removed beads of sweat from the Black astronaut's forehead. And that small change did fuel the thought that the CCA was personally antagonizing Gaines in EC Comics. And the code didn't have any overt forms of racism shown. From my research, there wasn't. They still allowed Black characters and Black stories to be permitted, but of course there is that implicit racism in allowing those stories to be permitted only if Black characters were depicted in certain ways that they found, morally acceptable. It was in that same year that EC Comics actually folded. EC Comics itself specialized in horror fiction, crime fiction, satire, military fiction, dark fantasy, and science fiction. And it had from 1940s until its closure. And it was basically all the things that the code hated. William Gaines tried to rally other publishers against this form of self-censorship that they were going to impose on themselves, but he found no success and did try to capitulate to the code to continue selling books. Out of frustration from the code and having closed EC Comics, Gaines did go on to form Mad Magazine, but the industry did lose some beloved comics from EC Comics when it closed, such as Tales from the Crypt, The Vault of Horror, Weird Fantasy, and Weird Science. It was the most notable closure of the time, but there were many other publishers that did close down during that time. We then moved to the 1960s, where publishers continued following the code, but we would start seeing more and more pushback, especially from bigger publishers later in the 1960s. While that was going on, a counterculture also bloomed, as they tend to do when moral panics take hold. During this time, the popularity of underground comics with an X rose as a counter to comics that stuck to the code. The X supposedly hinted at their X-rated content, which included recreational drug use, politics, free love, and rock music, the most evil of the topics at hand. In regards to the emergence of this counterculture, to the self-censorship that was going on. Cartoonist and writer Robert Crumb has been quoted saying, "People forget that that was what it was all about. That was why we did it. We didn't have anybody standing over us saying, no, you can't draw this, or you can't show that. We could do whatever we wanted." These comics were distributed by zines and underground newspapers until the Triple Threat Printment was founded, and they served as a publisher, distributor, and printer for some of the most popular underground comics at the time. There were numerous other presses that were also formed in San Francisco, which was the epicenter of this culture. Those included Ripe Off Press, Kitchen Sink Press, Apex Novelties, San Francisco Comic Book Company, and Last Gasp, which was based in Berkeley originally, but later moved to San Francisco. These comics in the counterculture to self-censorship were not without their flaws. It was a movement largely dominated by men, and a lot of these comics were rife with misogyny, but there were also notable comics and magazines that featured women as well. And these creations by women came about in the 70s. Meanwhile, in the mainstream at this time, we had X-Men, Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, Luke Cage, and Black Panther. At Marvel, and DC saw the creation of Green Lantern and Green Arrow. These were the comics from both publishers that would carefully address social issues, but mostly a lot of these comics centered on everyday life, from paying rent to a number of issues in interpersonal relationships, especially in Spider-Man. They really wanted to see the everyday man, and they could talk about social issues, but it was very, very carefully walked line. And in 1971, we did see Stan Lee take a stand with the help of the government. It was at this time that the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare approached Stan Lee, who was the head editor of Marvel at the time, and asked him to produce a comic that showed the dangers of drug use. Lee agreed and created a storyline for Amazing Spider-Man numbers 96 to 98 that dealt with the topic. When these issues were submitted to the CCA, they initially turned it down due to the mere discussion of narcotics, but Lee went and printed it anyways because the government was the one who asked him to do so he felt that that superseded the code. This prompted the CCA to update the code for the first time. This update allowed for illegal drug use to be shown only if it was portrayed negatively. The Comic Book Legal Defense Fund has an interview with Stan Lee, and he tells it as such. And when they were reading these Spider-Man stories, before they would put the seal of approval on the magazine, they said, "Oh no, you can't do this story." And I said, "Why?" They said, "According to the rules of the Code Authority, you can't mention drugs in a story." And I said, "Look, we're not telling kids to take drugs. This is an anti-drug theme." They said, "Oh no, it doesn't matter, you mentioned drugs." And I said, "But the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, a government agency, asked us to do it, and they said, it doesn't matter, you can't mention drugs." The Comic Book Legal Defense Fund goes on to point out that the word drugs is not contained in the original code at all, and it was not specifically prohibited by the CCA, but the comic fell under this general section that they liked to use to reject comics, which was Standards Part C, which prohibited all elements or techniques not specifically mentioned herein, but are contrary to the spirit and intent of the code and are considered violations of good taste or decency. The Comic Book Legal Defense Fund also discovered that there was another comic that was published prior that actually dealt with drug use that the code approved. And also, they noted how that rejection of the Spider-Man comic was done not by the CCA administrator at the time because he was out sick, but by someone else, showing just how subjective this sort of censorship can be. And in the end, in Stan's own words, he decided that we would do more harm to the country by not running the story than by running it. and that the United States government somehow took precedence over the CCA. The code also loosened its restrictions on crime comics and lifted the ban on horror comics at this time. And the rules on sexualization were also loosened. So it was, as the morals changed, as the people who were running the code changed, so did the code. And that is, as I've stated, a problem with this type of censorship and censorship in general. It is extremely subjective. We then get into the late 70s and 80s, and there were only 4 major publishers who still participated in the code at this time. And that was Archie, Marvel, Harvey, and DC. And there was the creation of direct market distribution at this time that actually allowed publishers to bypass the code altogether. Under the old system, wholesalers delivered comics to retailers along with other magazines. The wholesalers were the ones who served as the enforcers of the code. They did so by agreeing only to handle those comics with the code's approval, whereas with direct market distribution, distributors who only specialized in the making of comics solicited orders and distributed directly to retail outlets. And this allowed publishers to emerge without fear of censorship, and these new publishers experimented with materials, including those that were very overtly adult-oriented, so that they could expand the audience or what the perceived audience of comics were. In 1989, as a result of the rising independent publishers, the code sought to update their wording once again. They had a draft document made, but it was rejected because publishers like Archie, who catered mostly to a younger audience to begin with, preferred the 1971 code. And then the comic publisher Harvey wanted a new code, but felt this first draft had too many meaningless liberalizations, as they put it. DC, however, was considering at the time eliminating the seal of approval on their comics. They stated that it was an embarrassment and a hindrance to the creative talents of artists and writers. As a result, the Code Authority drafted a 2-part document that met DC's want for broader guidelines, and the principles of the Comics Code Authority, which it was called, contained general statements about violence, language, and other areas of concern. And there was also the second part, the editorial guideline, which listed specific rules for each of the content areas. And the CMAA at this time prohibited the release of this internal document to the public. By the early 2000s, 2001 to be specific, the 1989 code largely eroded from relevance, and the stamp of approval was disappearing from the shelves of general retailers. Comic book specialty stores, which is just your local comic book store, willingly carried comics without the seal, and even members of CMAA created imprints for the direct market, bypassing the review process. And Marvel struck a major blow this year when it withdrew from the Code Authority in favor of an in-house rating system. By 2011, there were only 2 publishers that still followed the code, Archie and DC Comics. And it was in January of 2011 that DC Comics dropped the seal of approval, and Archie soon followed. Today, publishers regulate the content of their own comics. They often have their own ratings on them still, teen, adult. Some of them have imprints of their comics that are for more mature audiences. I know that DC had, I don't know if they still have it, they had their Black Label comics, which were exclusively mature content, and they also had kids comic imprint. I believe it was DC Inc. that catered specifically to children, and most of the stuff you'd find on the shelves were teen. Marvel has their rating system, which is basically the video game rating system. Independent comics like Image, Volt, those I believe have their own rating system, but I don't look at the rating system when I pick up my comics, especially now that I do not work in the industry. But they have their own ways of curating their content to the audience that they intend to reach. So today, many states across the US are dealing with book banning, and book banning does really take a page from the Hays Code and from the Comic Book Authority Code, whether they're doing it consciously or unconsciously. Like the code, book banning today and throughout history has been a response to moral panics. Moral panics are a widespread fear that some evil thing or person threatens the values, interests, or well-being of a group of people or a society. There are thought to be 5 sequential stages in the construction of a moral panic, the first being an event, condition, episode, person, or group of persons is perceived and defined as a threat to societal values, safety, and interests. In today's society, that would be from the view of groups like Moms for Liberty, No Left Turn in Education, and groups like that, conservative Christian nationalists. That threat is LGBTQIA plus people, as well as Black people and other people of color, and feminism. Those are the things that are threatening society in their eyes. The nature of these apparent threats are amplified by the mass media, who present the supposed threat through simplistic symbolic rhetoric. Such portrayals appeal to the public prejudices, creating an evil in need of social control and victims, which are the moral majority. Again, this is the mass media, is Fox News, it is the presidential press secretary, it is honestly any of the news sources that are capitulating to Trump and his administration in the face of these threats and these accusations against DEI. Third, there is a sense of social anxiety and concern among the public that is aroused through these symbolic representations of the threat. The concern among book banners is that they will read about these groups of people and their ideas and somehow become a delinquent, a criminal, because of their reading of LGBTQIA plus folk, or Black people, or other people of color, or women just stating their experience and how women are oppressed in society. They're afraid that if their children read that, they will somehow become monsters. And then 4, there is the gatekeepers of morality. These are editors, religious leaders, politicians, and other moral thinking people. They respond to the threat with socially accredited experts pronouncing their diagnoses and solutions to the threat. This includes new laws or policies. The gatekeepers here are going to be those groups petitioning school boards for the removal of books, and those people attempting to get onto the school board or in local government positions. The condition, the prevalence of these books then disappears, submerges, or deteriorates and becomes more visible. The Comic Code had 41 provisions that purged sex, violence, and other content that did not keep to the moral standards of critics of comic books. And the thinking behind the creation of that was that they needed to respect the government and that parental authority needed to be stressed. And that also just led to the elimination of slang and colloquialisms. And the seal of approval just made sure that the content was appropriate for the most common denominator, which is always children. Book banners nowadays don't go after slang as they once did so far. Instead, they've taken their aim at terms and concepts that they find equally incomprehensible, like trans people, the rest of the LGBTQIA+, critical race theory, which they misconstrue as any talk about any race other than whiteness, and basically anything that doesn't align with the white supremacist Christian nationalist ideology that has overtaken the government, and most often those on the right. Book banners don't have an agency as of now that publishers must submit to, and they approve or disapprove of the content of a book, like those who oppose certain content in comics, but they do, as I said, try to infiltrate school boards and local government offices. So it's really important that we stay plugged in to what is going on in our local communities to be aware of when that is happening and when our freedom to read is in danger. And before I wrap up, I do want to stress that comic books are also a part of book banning today. They are still being targeted because they are a visual medium, and they are often downplayed as an art form and as a reading tool. I could go into so much of that, but I shan't. I do want to list some of the books that are most affected by book banning today. We have Assassination Classroom by Yusei Matsui, Drama by Reina Telgemir, Fun Home, a family tragicomic by Alison Bechtel, Lumberjanes and the Infernal Compass by Lila Sturgs, and Plotter Inc., Flamer by Mike Corrado, Genderqueer by Maya Kobabe, Persepolis, The Story of a Childhood by Marjan Satrapi, Mouse by Art Spiegelman, Blankets by Craig Thompson, Why the Last Man by Brian K. Vaughan. And those are just some of the ones that are targeted. And that is all I have for today. Remember to read banned books, talk about banned books, and protect banned books by talking to your local school boards, your library boards, and your county commissioners, or emailing them if you cannot go to their outrageous meeting times. That's what I do. Be a nuisance to them and let them know that you support everyone's freedom to read. And support your local bookstores and comic stores. And bye.